please feel free to start the panel. It's up to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was great to see Prof as always. The two of you are looking glamorous, unlike myself. I'm actually just recovering from COVID. I caught COVID 10 days ago, so I'm stuck in South Africa.
Oh my God! But
I'm
you're looking just
tonight,
fine. You're looking just fine. Don't worry. Which is most important here is the content. So I'm sure that your message is going to be clear. And thank you very much for being here once again.
Thank you, thank you. The last time I saw Prof actually was probably about 2 weeks ago. We saw each other at COP, and obviously the discussion at COP was all about the transition to a net zero world, and obviously there's been a lot of debate in Africa on that front in terms of how do we manage this transition. Our panel today is about governance and planning towards natural resources solutions for economic diversification. So we've got about 40 minutes or so, and I'm delighted to be welcoming with me Dr. Fernando Jorge Cardoso, who's the Executive Director at the Club of Lisbon. So I don't know if you can see Dr. Cardoso on screen. Also delighted to have Dr. Angele, who heads UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program for West Africa. I believe you're based in Lagos. And Dr. Oliveira, Director of International Studies at IPEA. And it's an interesting discussion, and it's one that's attracted a lot of research, a lot of discussions over the years. How do you move from the resource curse to using your resources in a way that's effective and that ultimately drives economic diversification, job creation, which is the big challenge of the 21st century, at least for Africa, where we need to create some 12 to 15 million.
So I think Omar has just lost his connection right now. Can you please confirm? So, yes, okay. I think we have, okay, no problem at all. I think we just lost Omar, our moderator. So, Professor, maybe we can engage with our guests right now. I don't know if we can keep our guests at the screen so we can proceed with the panel. Yes, thank you very much for being here with us once again. We have just lost the connection with Omar, but no problem at all. So I'm going to change a little bit the situation here because we have to deal with the things that we are not thinking that is going to happen. No problem at all. So, Professor, maybe you can please address the first question for our distinguished guest right now, maybe starting for Dr. Fernando. I don't know if Dr. Fernando has heard the... Oh, okay. Now we have Omar again. Omar, can you hear us?
Hello, can you see me?
Sure. Now I think we are good to go once again.
Yes, apologies for that. I don't know what happened there.
Perfect.
But ultimately, the discussion that's been had at COP is how do we manage the transition? And obviously the discussion that's been had in Africa over the years is how do we manage our resources effectively? How do we move from a rent-seeking philosophy or mindset, especially at the political level, to one that creates value addition, creates job creation and economic diversification? So we've got, I'm delighted to have fantastic panelists with me. And really the first question that I want to put to all three of you, and I want a very quick answer, 20, 30 seconds maximum. Are natural resources a good thing or not? So we'll just really 20 seconds each. I want to know whether it's a good thing to have natural resources or whether ultimately it will lead to bad policies and an over-reliance on that particular resource and therefore will lead to misgovernment and mismanagement. So are resources a good thing or not, natural resources? Dr. Cardoso, if we start with you very quickly.
Well, if you give me 20 seconds, I will be very direct. The question with Africa is not the resource curse. It is the leader's curse. We have a problem of management, of leadership in Africa. The problem of Africa is not resources. The more resources we have, the best. The question is the management of the resources and the interests of those that control power. That's my first lead.
Perfect. We'll go to you, Dr. Angele.
I think I would just follow Prof on the same path. That is, Africa has more than 60% of the population that is depending on natural resources. We have most of the hotspots in terms of biodiversity, and we are not really getting anywhere where we should be getting somewhere. So definitely, yes, there is no cost for that natural resources. But of course, we have a governance issue. We need vision, and we need a number of other, like maybe capacity to be able to transform those resources into real natural capital assets. Over.
Fantastic. And Dr. Ivan Oliveira?
Thanks, Omar. It's a pleasure to be with you. Well, I think Professor Cardoso got it the right way. Well, definitely it's not bad at all to be born rich somehow and have all the resources that can be used for economic development. But we do see that managing them is the critical issue. So that's why public policies are somehow one of the central points, I'd say, to really reap the benefits of a rich natural resources country.
Okay, so maybe we'll go back to you, Dr. Cardoso. I mean, you mentioned it's not a resource problem; it's a leadership problem. So, so I think the first part of the conversation, I like to look about how do we manage our resources effectively, and then maybe what I want to do is how do we manage the transition as well, given that a lot of countries are dependent on those resources today on for their revenues. I believe the revenues depend 70% of them depend on oil and gas, and in terms of foreign reserves, it's probably around 90%.
Okay, thank you. I would like to introduce something. Sorry.
So if we look at Mozambique.
Yes.
If we look at Mozambique, for example, where you were there a couple of weeks ago. So if you had to advise the government in terms of the natural resources, the big gas finds, in terms of how do you manage something like that responsibly and effectively?
Look, I will be very straight also on this. I came from Mozambique yesterday evening. So I was there for 1 week, but I know Mozambique because I am also a Mozambican. So I know those people. And what I have noticed in these last years in Mozambique is that there is a resource that usually is not referred in forum, in fora, or in formal meetings. And this resource, it's called illicit drug trade. It is called illicit trade on minerals. So when part of the wars that raging on some parts of Africa have to do with cobalt, with lithium, with coltan, with gold, with rubies, emeralds, diamonds, ivory, timber, and now more and more, mostly also in the eastern and western part of Africa, but more and more in the eastern part of Africa and in Mozambique also, the leaderships are bought by drug barons. So there is a lot of money in the economy. The economy is flowing, but this flow is coming from illicit money, drugs that are passing on through Mozambique towards South Africa, and from South Africa towards Australia and New Zealand, and then Europe. And then the traffic comes and goes because these drug dealers are very, very, very well, let's say, professional, let's put it that way. And a lot of money is being kept inside the countries and is flowing to the local authorities, to commerciants, local commerciants. And this is really corrupting the leadership of the country. You listen to very good speeches, but actually, when you look at the lives of the leaders, you will find that they have houses and cars and lots of things that everybody knows in Mozambique and in other countries, I would say, that money is not coming from, let's say, official work. I would like to be very straight on this because that's what is happening.
So how do you strengthen those governance structures ultimately? How do you make sure that even in relatively new democracies, you have strong governance structures to be able to manage those resources?
Yes. I think that is mostly a task for the people that live on those countries. But if it is also a task for those who engage in business and who engage in aid or whatever relationship with those countries. In my opinion, we should give up for all, for good, this way of trying to find acronyms to call donors partners of development, to call recipient countries partners of development, and all those good words that we are inventing in every fora that passes. The question is, the money comes from taxpayers, and you have internally and externally, you have the obligation to know how the money is being spent, and the transparency, and then the public audits should be forced by civil society, by those that are interested really in the country. I'm sorry, but I believe that we are losing the present leadership of most African countries. I will not say all of them, but most of them, and I could tell you names.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Cardoso. Look, Dr. Angele, I'd like to come to you. So we've just come back from COP, and the message in terms of Africa is it's not mixed. I mean, we understand we suffer from climate change ultimately, and we suffer disproportionately on the continent from climate change. That's a fact. And ultimately, it's the most vulnerable who suffer from climate change. And we know we need to do something about it. At the same time, a lot of our economies depend on certain resources. You're in Lagos, Nigeria depends on the oil and gas sector. And you'll have the vice president of Nigeria who said, we cannot just eliminate funding to the fossil fuel industry. Our economies and our development depends on it. And actually, our economic diversification depends on us having those revenues today to be able to invest in the future. So what's your take on it in terms of managing this transition and in terms of managing or balancing act about around moving away from fossil fuels and also having the funds to invest in development and to invest in economic diversification, which is what we're trying to do?
Yeah, thank you very much. In fact, I'm based in Abidjan, although I cover Nigeria. So that being said, I mean, we all are aware how much, to what extent Nigeria's economy is depending on oil. So there is needless to go back to the figures to say this is what is happening. But at the same time, so currently, actually, most of the energy, although we look at Nigeria, and then when we say Nigeria, we think fossil fuel, we think oil. But currently, most of the energy comes from traditional biomass and waste, which account for about 83% of total primary production. The rest of it, of course, is the fossil fuel and the hydropower. So today, for instance, we're saying 80% of the power generation in Nigeria comes from natural gas, and this is supported, by the whole master plan that the government has developed. And most of the remainder from oil, but Nigeria, of course, is still, like we say, the largest user of oil-fired backup generators. So that is a fact that is stated already. As Africa's largest economy, supplying an economy that is like 3 times larger today will require less energy demand if the energy mix were to be diversified, as you said. But furthermore, Nigeria has the second largest vehicle stock in sub-Saharan Africa. Everything about Nigeria seems to be like in the superlative. So the number of vehicles could grow from 14 to 37 million by 2040, with only 2 times more oil consumption if more stringent fuel economies, standard were introduced. So you mentioned the COP26, and of course at the COP26, we all heard the Nigerian president, pledging that Nigeria will cut its carbon emission by 20% below the business as usual levels by 2030 and eventually reach the net zero by 2060. So what does that mean for Nigeria? would Nigeria realize this transition? Energy transition, of course, could lead to economic transformation across all the sectors in Nigeria. And the Paris Agreement, as you know, has already set the transition expectations in motion. So it's like a rule book that is there, and we just have to open the pages and see where we want to be and what we want to do. However, the transition will require a number of infrastructure to be put in place, and investment to move forward. You mentioned the figures. To move forward with the transformation of the energy sector, because this is, I mean, we're basically here focusing on the energy sector. And again, we should remember that earlier this year, as media reported, the Nigerian president had announced that his country will need about 400 billion, you know, for electricity generation, transmission and distribution infrastructure. And if it is planned well, to reduce the dependence on fossil fuel if it was to be successful. So what does it say? We're saying the country already has developed a detailed energy transition plan and a roadmap that highlights the key role that gas will play in transitioning the economy, you know, across sectors. Nigeria's commitment to energy transition is reflected in a number of, you know, like documents and things and initiatives. And one of them that I would like to highlight here is the Energy Compact, which includes, you know, the government's flagship project to electrify 5 million households and 25 million people, you know, using decentralized solar energy solution. So this would be a major step in closing the energy access deficit by 2030. So in finishing on this, until you ask another question, I would say Nigeria will definitely need financial assistance, technology transfer, capacity building, and innovative partnership from advanced international players on the energy transition scene to make cleaner and efficient use and of all available resources to make more sustainable transition. But as Professor Cardoso said, you know, it's one thing to say I'm going to do, and it's another thing to actually do it. So we need the political will. We always talk about the political will. If it's not backed by a strong commitment and the resources, financial and the support and technology transfer that comes with it, I'm afraid in another 2060, we will still be chasing that transition in a country like Nigeria.
Okay, I mean, Dr. Liu, I mean, you say you're in Abidjan. It's just as good as Lagos, possibly. Well, I won't say if it's more fun or not, but no. But in terms of in terms of oil and gas, they recently discovered an oil and gas find earlier in the year.
Yes,
I think around April or May time. They made a big announcement.
Yes.
So obviously the government will be counting on the revenues from that oil and gas find to drive development, investment, etc., etc. So are you seeing a new approach from the government there in terms of how they're looking to manage these resources and how they're looking to manage those resources to help with the energy transition and also to diversify their economy?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there are many aspects you need to take into account, but if I wanted to make it shorter, what I would say is that, yes, there is oil now, which is being exported, which will be exported eventually. But the key, when you look at a country like Cote d'Ivoire, I would say about 70% of the people here work in the agricultural sector. So Cote d'Ivoire very much depends on the primary sector. Cote d'Ivoire is the top producer of cocoa, of cashew nuts, and you name them, there are many. So the thing here, what we need to know here is that oil is not actually the first, although it will definitely bring capitals, but it's not the first, the natural resource that the country will bank on. And as you know, Cote d'Ivoire has been like one of the top, one of the best, let's say, one of the countries where we saw a huge progress being made. But the thing is, when you look, we're talking about oil, but we can talk about forests. So this development this agriculture is being made at the expense of forests. And you know, Cote d'Ivoire has one of the heaviest deforestation rates in the world. And that is really an issue, because if you base your industry or your income on a primary sector, which is agriculture and everything, and you have climate change risk, and you have land use that really has to be revised. And you look at the way you're using natural resources, not really banking on the natural capital, that will be an issue, looking ahead.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liu. We'll go to Dr. Ivan Oliveira, and if I understand correctly, ultimately in terms of, and we're looking at a country like Brazil, I mean, we've seen a number of countries that have managed to use their resource bases to rapidly industrialize. The countries in the Far East, such as Malaysia and Indonesia and Thailand, come to mind in terms of using their natural resources to industrialize and diversify their economies. But if I believe correctly, I mean, what we've seen in Brazil is relatively rich in minerals, and we've got a big mineral company, Vale. Oil and gas, obviously, Petrobras is well known internationally. But ultimately, we saw Brazil excel in a number of areas in agriculture, for sure, and possibly also in the aerospace with Embraer, and really that was thought out strategy by the government to say, okay, look, we're going to train a number of people in these key strategic sectors, and see how we can then diversify economy and become global players. So and become less reliant on some of our other resources. Obviously, agriculture, to some extent, it is natural resources. But maybe can you tell us the examples of Brazil and what we can learn from the shift towards agriculture and in terms of economic diversification, so you're not reliant on one single resource?
Thanks, Omar. Well, yes, well, you got it right. And in fact, what we've seen throughout the last 50 to 60 years in Brazil was the build-up of an economy that was based on industrial production, but very strongly, especially after the 90s in agriculture. We had the revolution of agriculture in Brazil during the 90s. And in that sense, many issues were important, but I'd like to stress something that has to do with Embrapa and the role of research and somehow orienting the public policy towards somewhere. So that revolution was very important, and obviously right now Brazil is one of the key players in the agricultural global market. That has obviously generated a lot of incomes, and I'd say a whole new country has emerged from that. If you take what Brazil was in the 90s, what it is right now, even in Brasilia, where I stay, we can see all the soya beans production, the cattle production, and everything that came with it, with a good perspective that brought lots of income and somehow made the country richer. Obviously, we also became a very important player in some key international arenas on agriculture, for example, because of that role that we started to play, especially after the 90s. So we still continue to have a very diversified economy, but what we do see in the last couple of years, that's something that is critical, I'd say, especially with the force that China, or the whole world, especially in the commodity world, has played a very strong primarization of our exports. And right now, especially in the last 2 or 3 years with the pandemic crisis, very few products do count for an important part of our exports. That somehow starts we start to see the yellow lights on how we could manage to really bring our economy to a next level, especially integrating the old industry that we still have. So that's a problem that we have in Brazil. Somehow we got a very, let's say, modernized and top-end agriculture, especially obviously the ones that are export-led. But we still continue to have, in general, but an industry that is old and not very competitive. And due to, again, bringing back the role of public policy, due to many public policies that are put in place that somehow protect too much the country, that do protect some oligopoles that are essentially very few countries taking most of the market in many different markets in the country. So we need in Brazil to reflect on how to get that industrial basis that we do have to a new level in order to bring services into it, in order to make it more competitive. And I'm sure, and that's somehow what is being done right now, that opening up to the economy is critical. So having more trade agreements and having the good impacts of that contact with the world are critical for modernizing our industrial bases so that it can really go to the 21st century and we can really reap the benefits of being in a globalized world. And taking good care of the risks of focusing too much on too little sectors or just a few products. That's what we've been seeing, for example, in our foreign trade, due to the systemic and global forces that are there in the world market. And in taking into account the agriculture sector itself, it is very important and critical to see the role of transnational economies. So on the one hand, I'd like to stress the role of the state in the sense that we do need public policy and the state saying, well, here's where we want to go. Those are the incentives. Economic agents will go there and do what they have to do to reap the benefits and make profits and create development. That's critical. On the other hand, the transnational companies are very important for Brazil, since being the industrial sector, being the agricultural sector. But in some sectors, again, they do control it and they do whatever they want to. Just take the soybean production, for example. The trading companies that are in Brazil, they are everywhere. And they are the ones who really have a say something. And they really have the power to do whatever they want. Take, for example, the trade companies that are in Brazil, they are in Argentina. And from Brazil, they export soya beans. And from Argentina, they export oil and for example. So, and they come to the government to say, well, you need to tackle the Chinese tariff escalation because it is very critical. But those are the same ones that are exporting with the same tariff escalation from Argentina. So see, obviously they maximize the profits in the whole world. But there is a tension there, that's my point here, between the profits for transnational economies and the role of the state. And in some sectors, it is very clear, as it is in the case of soybeans. It is excellent for the country. Again, lots of income, very important in some critical junctures where we had a slowdown of the economy, and the agricultural sector was the power to create income and jobs. But this tension needs to be tackled, I'd say, in a better way so that we can really push our industry to a new level, but also generate the income that we need in the jobs to develop our economy in a new perspective with less concentration on few products and somehow taking out a little bit of the power, especially in those very concentrated markets where, again, the state must play a role. And one part of that role must be opening up the economy. So bringing the benefits of an open economy that is exactly the idea of a new companies would jump into the market and somehow help it develop and lower the prices and somehow tackle this concentrated market and all the bad, let's say, aspects and effects that we have from that.
Thank you, Dr. Oliveira. So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is during the 90s, we saw the rise of the agricultural sector in Brazil, and today ultimately there still needs to be a rethink because we've got oligopolies to some extent. that ultimately need to be shaken a little bit because we've plateaued in terms of efficiency. But I want to go back to the 90s, therefore. So what happened in the 90s? And we mentioned Embrapa, which is the sort of scientific arm of the agricultural sector in Brazil, which is an interesting example. I mean, we spoke about technology transfer earlier on, and so obviously this was a key actor, let's say, in Brazil's agricultural transformation. So, but that was obviously and I'm going to get to the role of the state, Dr. Cardoso, in a second. But Dr. Oliveira, so maybe you can tell us a little, very quickly, about in the 90s, what happened? What was that transformational moment that led to that economic diversification away from other economies or other industries towards agriculture and the growth of the agricultural sector?
Thanks, Omar. Yes, well, Embrapa is key there. Essentially, when we started to do the revolution in our Cerrado, as we call the part of the country where we could explore new lands, Embrapa is critical, and it continues to be somehow. So Brazil is one of the key players in the world when it comes to technology applied to agriculture, and obviously it is somehow one of the key aspects of our cooperation with Africa. But apart from that, one aspect that sometimes analysts tend to avoid talking about, but I do see it as a very important step, and especially for the agricultural sector in the 90s, that is the creation of Mercosur. And so if we think in the mid 90s, it was exactly when we started to see a very huge impact in the productivity of our agriculture in Brazil. That's exactly when we start to see the country starting to open up a little bit, and we had the Mercosur agreement. That at the very beginning of this process, when we were starting to apply new techniques and exploring new land and bringing productivity up in the agricultural sector, getting the inputs from Argentina that had better inputs for agriculture than Brazil, with a lower price, that was part of the agenda that we had in Mercosur, for example, was a very important movement at the very beginning of this, let's say, takeoff of our agricultural sector in Brazil in the mid 90s. So again, we're putting together a set of policy elements and that helped to push agriculture to a new level. And again, part of it was exactly going to the globe, especially in that case, pushing regional integration to a new level and opening up the market with Argentina. That at the very early stage was critical for getting inputs that were important in this takeoff. So again, the state is critical, but the private sector is obviously the one who will create and generate the income and the jobs. But having the right set of public policies and somehow, and here we see technology, trade, investment, so together as a portfolio of actions that the state might have in order to develop a sector is critical. And that's somehow what we could see in Brazil in the 90s. I would stress that idea of how opening up to Mercosur, a very small part of the globe, was critical for the takeoff, especially in the mid 90s, as we are starting to see that growth in productivity in the agriculture sector in Brazil.
Thank you very much. So technology ultimately and markets. And it's interesting because we've just come on the back of the Intra-Africa Trade Fair around the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So ultimately that is about creating a big market and hopefully creating synergies within those markets. Look, I'm going to go back to you, Dr. Cardoso. Obviously the role of the state is key. From your two opening statements, I mean, you seem to be very, very critical on the leadership. But obviously we can't just sort of erase everything and start from scratch. We're starting from where we are today. So you feel that the model is actually broken. And even in terms of managing our transition, in terms of decarbonization, in terms of managing our resources, we need to think differently about things, including how international partners, such as the UN, such as the development agencies, such as the development banks, they also need to rethink their interactions with government, with the states, so that we manage our resources better and we can manage this transition, both in terms of the energy transition and in terms of economic diversification. So we know the model is broken, but what are you suggesting in terms of repairing it, and how do we need to rethink it?
Thank you, Ben. Let me say the following. I'm not implying that every politician is a corrupt, number one. What I'm implying is that we are in the process of consolidating states all over Africa and in fragile situations. And this is being taken care by very much organized mafias that are buying a lot of people all over Africa just to extract timber. The tropical forests of Africa are being depleted not by governmental plans, but by mafias linked to local people that export all those things abroad. But let me say this, which is probably, I wouldn't say politically incorrect, but I believe that even these governments that exist there would agree with this. The question for Africa is technology, is not renewable energies, is not fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons is H, hydrogen, and C, carbon. Hydrogen and carbon are the more important elements for producing energy and for industry. So the major point is not to burn fossil fuels. If we stop burning oil, gas, and coal, so CO2 does not exist. And I will add the following. There are technologies for doing this. There are big agreements between Japan and Australia just to extract from the coal of Australia the hydrogen without burning the coal. And there is a very big business agreement with Saudi Arabia to extract hydrogen from oil without burning oil. So we are in the verge to see happening new technologies. And renewable energies are important, but they are not clean energies. Let's not fool ourselves. And if we speak about batteries from the sun, we are speaking about a huge quantity of area that is needed to provide energy. And I would add the following: the production, even if we burn the fossil fuels, the emission of CO2 by all the African countries in the mixed equation of production and consumption of energy is completely inexistent. It's 1% of the total. It will be during this decade and the next decade. So the problem for us in Africa is that this is happening in other countries. So the problem is that we should be very much attentive to new technologies, just not to receive again the past technologies from renewable energies or whatever, but to be on the hedge and just to make business what is being now invented. So my point is that even with the elites and with the government elites that exist in Africa, maybe they could be interested in doing this. So let's not buy the thing that fossil fuels are bad, renewable energies are good. No, the bad thing is to burn fossil fuels. And there are technologies that are being developed to stop this. And we have to be very attentive in Africa about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cardoso. If I can go to you, Dr. Liu, I think there are 2 points that I picked up there. The first is there seems to be a lot of illicit trade, for example, illicit trade in terms of timber, and this illicit market of goods ultimately is leading to weak governance structures. That's number one. And I wanted to hear UNEP's perspective there in terms of, especially around deforestation and the illicit trade of timber, and whether things are getting better or not. I mean, we've seen a lot of activity, I know, in Cameroon and Gabon, whereby they're trying to protect their forests, and DRC. The other one is around technology. and whether technology will save us to some extent in terms of our future energy use, or do we need to be a bit more realistic and start acting now and start thinking differently about things? Dr. Liu, I think you may be on mute.
Wow, sorry. Thank you very much. I would say there are trends. I mean, we've been working on this, you know, trying to support countries in their effort to use their natural resources more sustainably. But as you said, I mean, the illegal trade is an issue that is beyond just the environmental, you know, area. I mean, that is now affecting, we're talking about nature, you know, like biodiversity, and it goes beyond biodiversity, and it is a big issue that need to be addressed. But of course, we need to have this common approach that will make it more, that will carry the message and make it more forceful. What we are saying is every year, now and then, and every year in and year out, we meet, we make decisions, but the problem is how are those decisions implemented, even from those who have, really pushed those decisions to be made. So whereas we have poverty, so if we don't address poverty, it will be, and we don't address the critical issues, we don't make the development. You talked about Cote d'Ivoire. We look at Cote d'Ivoire, this is a country where we've had, like since 2012, we've had, a really robust growth, economic growth. But of course, we're not talking about the impact of the COVID. But what is happening, it has been there, but it's not inclusive. So in as long as rural people in the rural areas are still facing poverty, it's increasing instead of decreasing, you will always have, there will always be like the background or some sort of support to these illegal trades. I mean, I want to even add issues of the security. As you know, now we are in a region where in the Sahel, you have all this terrorism and everything. But, it builds on those, poverty and those to flourish. Now on the technology, definitely technologies are important, and we cannot really move unless, and I was very happy to hear Professor Cardoso saying that there is this possibility of having, like extracting using the fuel without burning it, using the fossil fuel without burning it, which is a solution I'm sure we would be happy to see how we can, come together as the UN, because yes, it's not just UNEP, it's a UN. But as we wait for that, what is important is like, when you look at the countries in this part of Africa, and like the rest of Africa, they all identify, sustainable natural resources as a key priority to ensure that they develop. But the thing is, when you look at the budget, the economy ministers will, let's say, natural resources don't really get that important budget to be able to be protected. And we need to look at, if we are going to develop or to transition toward a low carbon type of development, how are we going to do it without making sure that we look at the natural capital? How? That is not possible. So what we are saying is there are a number of key or important opportunities that can be used, but it all starts with accounting, for our natural capital. What is it that we have and how can we use it wisely? Then we will have other opportunities that will be the basis for this, green, we would say green economy. And then we will look at the, how we work to ensure that we can bank on the value chains, then we bring in the circular economy. There are a number of things. We also look at the food, because food is an important sector also. So in addition to natural capital accounting, what are the benefits for the government and what are the benefits for the private sector? Because we are saying, if you want to bring the private sector to be able to come in the business of climate change and help the countries, governments, really promote low carbon emission, the type of development, we need to create conditions that will bring them on board. And we're also looking at the whole, we're talking about women, we're talking about communities. The civil professor talked about civil society at the beginning, I think during his first intervention. And these are keys to be able, to bring countries and to bring government to understand where we want to go. So like we said, public and private finance and investment are important, especially we're looking at those that are mobilized to respond to the COVID-19 induced crisis. How can they accelerate, like a just transition to a green and a just inclusive social economy? This is a good opportunity. It is a problem, but it is at the same time an opportunity for our country to restart afresh. So there are a number of things that we can say like that. I mean, there are definitely a number of avenues that we would be able to follow. And in fact, the UN has already, and a few partners have already started working, in developing tools, frameworks, and to assist countries in this travel journey. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liu. I'm going to go to Caroline very quickly. We've got a couple of questions, I believe, for Dr. Fernando Cardoso and Dr. Oliveira. What I'd like to say is what we have seen. I mean, we have seen economic diversification, and ultimately, Dr. Ivan mentioned cooperation thanks to Mercosur. Hopefully, with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and the free trade area, we may see this. I mean, someone from Morocco last week was saying that they're looking to export 1 million cars a year, but most of their inputs are being imported from outside of Africa. Whilst ultimately, you've got the bauxite in Guinea to turn into aluminium, you've got the copper in Zambia. So ultimately, once we start thinking about those value chains, hopefully we can look at greater beneficiation on the continent, and ultimately also that will ultimately reduce carbon emissions, because taking something all the way to China and back is obviously generates carbon emissions in terms of freight and transport. Caroline, I know you've got a couple of questions from our audience, so maybe you can put them to our eminent panelists.
Yeah, sure, Omar. So our team is collecting a few questions sent from the audience via the YouTube chat and also social media. So we have one so far for Dr. Ivan Oliveira. What should Brazil do to boost its regional integration to better connect agriculture and industries to international markets? Dr. Ivan, please.
Thanks, Carolina, and our colleague who made the question. That's a very important point, and there are a couple of projects on the way. So that's the good point here. For example, if we take agriculture, obviously the central part of Brazil now is key to the production of food in the country, especially to export. And one of the projects that I'd like to mention here is the bioceanic corridor that's going to link Mato Grosso do Sul to the ports in the north of Chile, passing through Argentina and Paraguay. And it is one of those projects of infrastructural integration in the region that are taking place. And IPEA, my institution, is one of the institutions that are following these projects for some time now. We made a couple of impact analysis on Brazil and on the other countries of the corridor. So there is very good hope that with some bridges, it's going to be a road corridor. So it's going to link the central part of Brazil to the north of Chile, but there is room to increase, let's say, production connections among the countries of the region, and especially regarding agriculture due to the role that it plays in the central part of Brazil. So there are a couple of projects on the way, and essentially infrastructure is critical in that sense. Obviously, in South America, we have a free trade area right now, so tariffs are not important. But infrastructure is critical, and non-tariff barriers are critical. Another issue that we've been tackling here at IPEA, where we try to assess how non-tariff barriers sometimes do not allow our companies to trade in the agricultural sector. That's also very, very important. So tackling non-tariff barriers and investing a lot more in infrastructure are the two, let's say, key channels in order to develop our integration with with the countries of South America. And I'd say that it should be seen as a very important step in order to make Brazil, let's say, closer to the global economy itself. So building up those regional value chains where we can build them is very important. And definitely building up on agriculture, so all the chains related to agricultural products is something that we can do. And we do hope that projects like this bi-oceanic corridor may help us to develop those sectors furthermore. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe there was another question, Caroline, for Dr. Cardoso. Is that right?
Yes, sure, Omar. So we have selected also one for Dr. Angele, but I will start with Dr. Fernando. How have international players like the US, Europe, and China adapted to this new scenario right now?
Well, I don't know what a new scenario means, but let's say that the entrance of China in the equation produced a huge growth on demand of commodities in the beginning of the century, and also a huge availability of funds for infrastructures and also for industry investment, although the industry investment was not very much used because we do not have private sectors, developed private sectors in Africa. Just to be able to do that. In some countries there are more, in other countries there are less. But my point is that China was an element, a very important element in the equation on this century. And the United States of America is completely, Africa is completely marginal for United States of America, but in some regions. And we know what these regions are. It is the regions close to the Red Sea, and in some Sahelian regions because of terrorism, and because terrorism is considered by the Americans as a global threat. And in some points also the drug traffic, but mostly on the western coast, because in the eastern coast they do not care, because heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamines, they do not go to the United States of America. They go to Europe, they go to Australia, they go to New Zealand, they go to South Africa, and they go to the countries in the region. So the point is that China, yes, US does bother about what's going on in most of African countries. Europe has this fixed, let's say, mythology of regional economic integration. Regional economic integration is a myth, but it's more than a myth, it's an harmful objective, because you cannot have regional economic integration without having tradable goods. And you do not have tradable goods if you do not have industrialized countries and infrastructures. So the point is, for most, or not to say all, the African countries, is to develop national economies, is to develop regional infrastructures, no doubt, but national industries. And with that, regional economic integration is possible. To put the things the other side, beginning by regional economic integration and then going to infrastructures and going to investment, it is completely wrong. My point is, most of African leadership, since the beginning, since the formation of the African Union, the Organization of African Union, I mean, regional economic integration is in the minds, let's say, of African leaderships. Let's unite Africa. Unite Africa. Africa is not a country. Africa are 54 countries with 54 different situations. And inside each African country, there are different cultures, different languages, different economic situations, different kinds of... So the point is that we are living, historically speaking, in the process of consolidating states. And that is something that the entrance of China, I'm not implying that China saw that, because they act by their own interests, okay? But their interests, let's say, were in line with the African states, and the sense that this is what we really needed. And that happened. Unfortunately, China has a lot of troubles now. They cease to have accidents. So they do not have money to let's say, to continue to spread money all over the world in this moment. And then growth in Africa is suffering from that. European Union is not interested in investing in infrastructures. Is interesting on supporting this idea of Africa, of regional economic integration and things like that. Why? Because this does not cost money. That's the point. And for the leaderships, it is this myth we have to develop what has to be developed to produce the conditions for regional economic integration to succeed. Thanks.
Thank you, Prof. So, look, I think the leaders of the different countries will tell you that industrialization is key, and they understand the importance of infrastructure and of an industrial policy, and they're working on it to try and accelerate it. And we've seen some successful stories on the continent. We've seen Ethiopia's leather industry. We've seen South Africa and Egypt making some strides in textiles and in other sectors. We're seeing some developments, even in terms of mining, in terms of agriculture in Kenya, the horticulture industry. So industrialization is definitely a key premise of any national development plan today. So I believe
you say so. I'm happy.
Well, it's part of the
I agree with you. I agree with you.
Everything comes down to it. You know, we're talking about, at the end, it's about human well-being.
Yeah. But leadership is critical, both in terms of making sure that you do not apply a rent-seeking mentality to natural resources. I was hearing today that the DRC, possibly one of the richest countries in terms of its what's underneath its earth, with trillions of dollars worth of lithium and cobalt and all those other minerals you mentioned, Professor. But ultimately, it's how do we use it to then develop other sectors and other industries,
yes,
and for the well-being of our people. And that only comes back down to one thing: is good leadership. We've seen bad leadership not only in Africa but across the world. I'm seeing it in different countries today. And when we see good leadership can be transformational. Bad leadership, obviously, will
including in London, yes.
We'll take you back a few years. So I think our time is up. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Fernando Jorge Cardoso, and Dr. Angele in Abidjan, and Dr. Ivan Oliveira. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Omar. It's always a pleasure to be engaged with you. It was a pleasure for me to learn with all our distinguished speakers. Thank you very much for being here with us today.